Under the harsh glare of studio lights, the set of Global Discourse Unraveled buzzed with electric tension. This wasn't just another episode of the late-night talk show renowned for its unapologetic deep dives into philosophy, science, and belief. It was a cultural showdown. At the heart of it sat Caroline Leavitt, a rising intellectual force, her demeanor calm, yet radiating an unshakable resolve. Opposite her was Alan Brooks, a seasoned atheist journalist whose razor-sharp wit and unrelenting skepticism had dismantled countless guests over the years. Tonight, millions tuned in, their anticipation palpable, not just in the sleek, minimalist studio, but across the world. The topic? The existence of God, a question as old as humanity itself, yet one that still ignited fierce debate. The first half hour unfolded predictably. Alan lobbed questions at Caroline with surgical precision: the rise of secularism, the triumphs of scientific discovery, the decline of organized religion. Caroline met each challenge with poise, her answers thoughtful and layered, revealing not just a debater's skill, but a rare ability to weave complex ideas into something relatable. She wasn't here to preach, she was here to engage, to reach beyond the studio's glass walls and into the minds of doubters and believers alike. Alan, meanwhile, paced his arguments like a predator stalking prey, his tone measured but his intent clear. He was building toward something bigger. Then came the shift. Alan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, a telltale sign to anyone who'd watched him spar before. The air thickened as he pivoted from broad societal trends to the personal, the existential. "Caroline," he began, his voice steady but edged with provocation, "you've often spoken of God as a cornerstone of your worldview. You've even suggested that belief in a higher power gives life meaning, purpose. But let's cut through the noise. Religion, especially the idea of a personal God, is fading. Fewer people buy into it every year. Science has explained the cosmos, evolution, consciousness, things we once attributed to divine hands. So why cling to this notion of God? Why insist it's still relevant?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Alan wasn't just questioning her belief. He was attacking its foundation, framing faith as a relic of a less enlightened age. He pressed on, unrelenting. "I ask because there are millions out there, smart, rational people, who see God as a fairy tale, a comforting story for those too afraid to face a universe without meaning. They'd say belief doesn't elevate us. It shackles us to outdated myths. Is that fair, Caroline? Or are you too entrenched to see that God's time has passed?" The room seemed to shrink, the weight of his words pressing down. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the cameras zooming in to catch every nuance, every twitch of Caroline's expression, every flicker in Alan's gaze. He'd lit a fuse, and everyone waited to see if it would fizzle or explode. For a moment, silence reigned. Caroline didn't flinch. She inhaled deeply, tilted her head just enough to signal she'd absorbed the blow, and then a faint, almost enigmatic smile curved her lips. "Alan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you assume God is a hypothesis science can disprove, a gap to be filled by equations or fossils? But what if God isn't an answer to how? What if God is the why that science can't touch? You see a fading myth. I see a question that refuses to die." The studio held its breath. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something seismic, because she knew exactly what to say next. Caroline held the room in her grasp. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He was waiting. The audience was waiting too, perched on the edge of their seats. The silence in the studio wasn't awkward. It was charged, crackling with the unspoken stakes of their exchange. Caroline let Alan's challenge linger for a heartbeat longer, her gaze steady, before she spoke. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "that it holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that invited him to follow her reasoning. What do people reach for when science runs dry? Alan's lips twitched, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his skepticism, but he held his silence. She pressed forward, her words deliberate. It's easy to scoff at faith when the world feels predictable, when your bills are paid, when your loved ones are safe, when the universe seems to hum along rationally. But what happens when that illusion shatters? When you're sitting in a hospital room watching someone you love slip away, when the scans are blank and the experts are out of answers, when you're left with nothing but the raw ache of loss, what do you cling to then? The studio fell into a hush so deep it felt like time had paused. Even the crew, usually bustling behind the scenes, stood frozen, caught in the gravity of her words. Alan adjusted his tie, his first sign of unease, but his gaze never left hers. People turn to faith because they're desperate, he countered, his tone clipped. That doesn't make it true. It makes it a placebo. Caroline nodded faintly, as if she'd anticipated this. Comfort isn't a flaw, Alan. It's human. And faith isn't just comfort, it's strength. It's the conviction that even when everything crumbles, there's still purpose woven into the chaos. You can call that delusional, but I'd argue it's what's kept humanity standing through millennia of pain. Alan exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting in his seat, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. So, you're saying belief is a survival mechanism? I'm saying belief is what makes survival matter, she replied, her voice unwavering. He smirked, shaking his head. You're good, Caroline, I'll give you that. But let's deal in reality. He gestured with his hand, as if redirecting the conversation. Religion has blood on its hands. Wars, inquisitions, tyranny. You can't gloss over that and pretend faith is some pure, noble ideal. Caroline's expression remained steady. I won't pretend otherwise. People have warped faith into something ugly. I'll grant you that. But let's not cherry-pick. Faith has also fueled the best of us. The end of slavery, the fight for equality, the schools and shelters built by those who felt a higher calling. You don't get to dismiss the light because of the shadows. Alan leaned back, studying her, his usual quick retort absent. Caroline seized the moment, leaning forward just enough to shift the dynamic. But if you want the real reason I hold to faith, not statistics, not history, it's because of a woman I met 12 years ago. A faint crease formed between Alan's brows. A woman? Caroline nodded, her voice softening, carrying a new weight. Her name was Margaret. She showed me something about faith that no argument could unravel. A quiet, unshakable trust forged in a fire I couldn't imagine. She'd lost everything. Her home, her health, her son. And yet, she smiled at me and said, God's still here. Caroline rested her hands on the table, her fingers lightly interlaced. Her gaze didn't waver as she began speaking, her voice quieter now, more deliberate, pulling the room into the intimacy of her recollection. 12 years ago, I was just out of university, working as a junior researcher in Boston. My days were filled with data, reports, endless debates about ethics and science. I thought reason was the ultimate tool to navigate life. But then I met Margaret. Alan remained silent, his posture stiff, his pen motionless on the desk. The audience leaned in, captivated not by drama, but by the raw authenticity threading through her words. Margaret was 72. I met her at a small community forum on grief and resilience, something I'd been assigned to cover. Not out of interest, but obligation. I was there to take notes, nod politely, and move on. But Margaret, she stopped me cold. Caroline let out a faint breath, as if the memory carried a physical weight. She wasn't imposing or loud. She was gentle, almost fragile in her way. Yet when she spoke, you couldn't help but listen. There was this quiet power in her, the kind forged in fires that should have destroyed her. Alan's face was unreadable, but his eyes weren't on his notes anymore. They were locked on Caroline, absorbing every word. She told me she'd lost 2 sons, one to leukemia, one to a car accident. Her husband had died of a heart attack years before. No siblings, no relatives left to lean on. And yet, there she was, sitting with me over a cup of coffee, smiling softly, asking how my week had been. Caroline's voice caught for a fleeting moment, a crack in her composure. I asked her how she did it, how she could face that much pain and still radiate warmth as if life hadn't gutted her. She looked at me, not with pity or defiance, just clarity, and said something I'll carry forever. Caroline swallowed, her eyes meeting Alan's, not as a foe, but as someone she needed to reach. She said, "Faith isn't about evidence. It's about what holds you up when evidence fails." The studio grew so still that even the faint buzz of the lights seemed to vanish. She told me she woke up every day and thanked God, not because her life was kind, not because she'd been spared, but because she was still breathing, because she believed there was meaning left in the hours she had. Caroline exhaled slowly, the weight of the memory settling over her. I was 22, thought I had strength figured out, ambition, logic, grit, but Margaret redefined it for me. I saw that faith isn't just a lifeline for the desperate. It's the spine that keeps people upright when everything else collapses. She let the words hang, heavy and deliberate. Alan blinked, his mouth parting slightly as if to interject, but he hesitated, caught off guard. Before he could gather his thoughts, Caroline pressed on, her tone shifting with quiet urgency. And then she told me something that flipped everything I thought I knew. Alan's mouth remained slightly open, as if words were forming but couldn't quite break free. The gravity of Caroline's story pressed down on the studio, thick and unyielding. The audience, usually restless with murmurs or applause, sat in stunned silence, every eye fixed on her. Even the host, typically quick to steer the conversation, seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. Caroline didn't rush to fill the quiet. She let it stretch, amplifying the weight of what she'd shared. Alan finally cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, his composure fraying at the edges. "That's a powerful story," he conceded, his voice quieter than before. "But don't you think it's just that, a story? Margaret found something that worked for her, but that doesn't make faith some universal bedrock." Caroline nodded slightly, as if she'd anticipated the pushback. "You're right about one piece of it," she said, her tone even but inviting. "Faith isn't about convincing the world with a formula. It's about what people endure, what carries them through. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear that thread running through countless lives in a million quiet variations." Alan exhaled, running a hand across his forehead, his skepticism still intact but less rigid. "That's where I stumble, Caroline. Faith isn't concrete. It's emotions, anecdotes, things that don't hold up to scrutiny. Yet people wield it to shape choices that ripple out to everyone." Caroline tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "You mean like love?" Alan blinked, caught off guard. "Love," she repeated, letting the words settle. "It's not quantifiable. It's not a lab result. You can't pin it down with data or prove it's real in some sterile sense. But people build lives around it, risk everything for it, find strength in it when reason alone would tell them to give up. Would you tell a parent clinging to love for a dying child that it's just a sentimental prop, unreal because it can't be dissected?" Alan shifted in his seat, his hands resting uneasily on the desk, but he didn't cut in. "That's the core of faith," Caroline continued, her voice steady and clear. "It's not about dominating others or dictating rules. It's how people stitch meaning into the wreckage of life. You can call it illogical, but when someone's world collapses and they still rise the next morning, still find a spark to keep moving, there's something there, something you can't chart on a graph, but you can't dismiss either." Alan's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, his usual edge dulled. He wasn't just sparring now. He was wrestling with her words. The host stepped in, sensing the shift. "Alan, anything to add?" Alan opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it again. He glanced at the audience as if seeking an anchor, but the room remained still, hanging on the exchange. When he spoke, his tone had softened, stripped of its earlier bite. I think I need to sit with that." A faint murmur stirred through the crowd, not the fiery clash they'd braced for, Not a triumphant knockout, but something rarer, a crack of vulnerability. Yet the real reverberation, the one that would echo far beyond the studio, was still unfolding. The debate closed shortly after, but the air felt unresolved. The usual applause was tentative, subdued, as if the audience didn't know how to process what they'd witnessed. This wasn't a tidy talking point to cheer or jeer. They'd felt something deeper, something harder to shake off. Alan gave Caroline a brief nod before unclipping his mic and stepping off stage. He didn't linger for banter or analysis, heading straight for the exit, his shoulders tight, his mind visibly churning. Caroline stayed seated a moment longer, absorbing the scene, the crew's hushed exchanges, the audience's lingering stares. Some faces softened with emotion, others furrowed with unease. No one was untouched. The second the cameras cut, her phone erupted. Texts, calls, notifications stacking up. Social media was ablaze, snippets of their clash already viral. But what struck Caroline most wasn't the praise from her usual allies. It was the voices from the other side. I'm not a believer, but she made me question something I haven't in years. I've never heard faith framed without judgment. That hit different. This wasn't about politics. This was about something bigger. Comment after comment, post after post. People weren't arguing the way they typically did. Sure, the usual skeptics piped up, the predictable pushback from those who scoffed at the exchange. But something unusual was unfolding, something Caroline hadn't witnessed in years. People weren't just firing off opinions, they were pausing, absorbing. Her team sprang into action, fielding a deluge of press inquiries as headlines blazed across screens within hours. Caroline Levitt stuns veteran journalist in unforgettable clash, and did this debate just redefine faith in modern America? Even late-night shows, usually quick to skewer voices like hers, pivoted, discussing the moment not with snark, but with a rare sincerity. And then there was Alan. He'd gone quiet that night. No tweets, no interviews, no post-debate spin. Known for seizing the narrative, his silence was deafening until 8:37 the next morning, when he posted, 30 years in journalism, and last night was the first time I left an interview with more questions than I started with. No flourish, no backpedaling, just candor, and that single line unleashed a fresh surge. But the real ripple effect wouldn't crystallize until days later. What began as a routine intellectual sparring match had morphed into something seismic. It wasn't about Caroline or Alan anymore. It tapped into a hunger people had buried, a yearning for meaning they'd been too guarded to voice. The internet became a battleground of reflection, impossible to navigate without stumbling on the debate's fallout. Podcasters, writers, and talking heads pounced. Some dubbed it a turning point for faith's place in public life, others a jolt to a sleeping culture. The most striking responses, though, came from unlikely corners. A comedian notorious for skewering religion confessed on air, "I'm still an atheist, but she made me want to believe in something, and that's wild." A respected physicist tweeted, "Faith and reason aren't oil and water. Last night showed why people cling to belief amid the unknown." Then there were the messages flooding Caroline's inbox. She'd always gotten mail, praise from allies, barbs from detractors, policy pitches. But this wave was different. Personal. One email stopped her cold, from a woman named Sarah. "I haven't prayed in 25 years, it read. "Faith walked out the door when my brother died. But after your debate, I sat on my porch and sobbed. Not because I'm suddenly saved, but because I felt this ache for something bigger I'd forgotten I needed. You made me wonder again." "Thank you," Caroline reread it. Then again, letting the words sink in. She'd built her career on platforms and principles, battling over legislation and ideology. But this transcended the game of wins and losses. This wasn't about swaying voters or clinching a soundbite. She leaned back, staring at the screen, the hum of her office fading. Sarah's words echoed Margaret's quiet resilience, that same thread of longing woven through countless others reaching out. People weren't asking her for dogma or doctrine. They were grappling with something raw, something human. The debate had cracked open a space where doubt and hope could coexist, where faith wasn't a weapon, but a question. Critics still circled, dismissing it as sentimental noise, but the shift was undeniable. For every cynic, there were 10 more like Sarah, stirred, unsettled, searching. Caroline closed her laptop, the weight of it settling in her chest. She'd spent years fighting for tangible outcomes, laws, reforms, metrics. But this was different. This was about something that couldn't be measured in polls or political victories. It was about a dialogue people had long avoided. It wasn't just Sarah. In the weeks that followed, letters and messages trickled in, each carrying echoes of personal Margarets, fathers, friends, a nurse who'd offered a prayer in a moment of despair. This wasn't about settling scores or claiming converts. It wasn't about triumphing over doubters. It was about showing that faith, whether in a higher power, in each other, or in something still undefined, wasn't frailty. It was the steel in people's spines, the pulse that kept them moving forward. That truth, once spoken, couldn't be undone by any rebuttal. As the frenzy of the debate began to quiet, one certainty emerged. This wasn't a fleeting headline or a blip drowned out by the relentless churn of online chatter. It was a signal flare, a quiet, stubborn proof that, despite the noise of division, despite the chorus declaring faith irrelevant, people were still reaching for something more, something beyond what they could hold. Caroline hadn't aimed to rewrite beliefs that night. She'd only shared a memory, but sometimes a memory was enough. For every voice that lingered on her words, for every heart nudged awake, the impact stretched further than she'd imagined. If her story sparked a flicker in someone, Sarah on her porch, a stranger pausing mid-scroll, then it wasn't meant to stop there. Don't let it fade, she thought. Keep wrestling with it. Keep digging. Keep listening to the quiet stirrings too often ignored. The real answers, the ones that matter, rarely come from clinching a point. They bloom in the exchanges we stumble into, the ones we never saw coming. She sat at her desk, the emails still piling up, each one a thread in a tapestry she hadn't planned to weave. The world kept spinning, cynics kept scoffing, pundits kept dissecting. But beneath it all, something had shifted. People were talking, feeling, questioning, and that was different. This was about something that couldn't be measured in polls. The story of Caroline and Alan offers profound lessons that resonate deeply, especially for older audiences who've weathered life's storms. One key message is that faith, whether in God, humanity, or purpose, isn't a sign of weakness but a source of resilience. Like Margaret, who smiled through unimaginable loss, it's the quiet strength that keeps us standing when logic alone falters. For those in their later years, this reminds us that our scars don't define us. What we choose to hold on to does. Another lesson is the power of listening, not to win, but to understand. Caroline didn't defeat Alan with arguments. She reached him with a story, showing that vulnerability can bridge divides. As we age, we learn that life's richest moments often come not from proving a point, but from sharing what's shaped us. Finally, the story urges us to keep searching for meaning, even when answers elude us. For older souls, this is a call to reflect on our own Margarets, those who taught us hope, and to pass that wisdom forward. Faith, resilience, and connection aren't just ideas. They're lifelines we can still grasp, no matter the years behind us.